Module 11. Module 11. Internal conflicts and external confusion, 1974 to 1981. Now, this is a period of mixed and a lot of different cross currents of things that were happening in the world, as well as that were happening in the United States. So let's start off by talking about the end of the Vietnam War. 1975 is the fall of Saigon, a really very negative time in American history when finally the South Vietnamese government that had been supported by the United States fell to the Communist Party, to the South Vietnamese Communists, the National Liberation Front, or the Viet Cong as it was called. And so several 100,000 South Vietnamese were evacuated by the United States, people who had married American GIs, people who had been part of the South Vietnamese government, people who had supported the Americans were evacuated. There were a lot of people who couldn't get on the airplanes and who couldn't leave and who were left to be presumably punished and some executed by the Vietnamese communists. And so there were these scenes of the South Vietnamese pro-American people seeking refuge in the embassy, trying to be evacuated on American helicopters, and a lot of people who couldn't get on the helicopters were clamoring. So there were these news stories of American GIs using their rifle butts to knock the Vietnamese, these frantic, hysterical Vietnamese, using their rifle butts to knock the Vietnamese off of the American helicopters that were trying to leave. So it was a great humiliation for the country. Vietnam was unquestionably a defeat, regardless of what some of the people say now. Now we're, this is 1915, this is 2015, and here we are several years later after Vietnam, and some newspapers are trying to say that it was not a defeat, but it was unquestionably a defeat, and it was perceived as that at the time, and it had an enormous depressive, psychological, disillusioning effect throughout the 1970s. So we also want to talk about a couple of other things very quickly in this module. Another thing that in the world at large was that the arms race, there was a movement towards détente between the United States and the Soviet Union. But because of some new ballistic changes in ballistics technology, especially the MIRV, the multiple reentry vehicle missiles that could spew out several warheads at a time, there was a temporary increase and resurgence in the arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. So the SALT talks ran into the strategic arms liberation talks, ran into some problems. On the bright side of U.S.-Soviet relations was the Helsinki Accords, which was in 1974, which was a meeting between the Soviet Union and Western European countries and the U.S., in which there were liberalization. The Western European countries and the U.S. agreed to tacitly recognize formally the boundaries of the communist countries, but in return, the Russians permitted a lot of freer exchange of people and goods and information. And so this opening up of the Iron Curtain was really one of the major factors that helped to weaken communism and really helped to end the Cold War. So the Helsinki agreements were really a factor leading to the collapse of communism. But the American hardliners, the professional anti-communist politicians in Congress opposed the Helsinki Agreement, especially Senator Henry Jackson of Washington State, Henry Scoop Jackson. His constituency was in housed Boeing aircraft. He was often called the senator from Boeing because Boeing's headquarters were in Seattle. And another one was Richard Pearl, who was a very strong neoconservative, very anti-communist Cold Warrior, and these guys opposed the Helsinki Accords. Another factor was in Latin America, and the story of Allende's Chile, this is in your book, the overthrow of the Marxist government. Salvador Allende was a duly elected president. He was elected by a plurality, but not a majority, but still he was legally, peacefully elected president of Chile. He was a Marxist, and he proceeded to try to help the poor people and the working class people of Chile. And the American head of the ITT, the American International Telegraph and Telephone Company, openly called for the United States to try to overthrow him. And there's strong evidence that the CIA was working to overthrow Allende and was working with the Chilean military, especially General Augusto Pinochet. So Allende was overthrown and was killed allegedly by suicide, but as we know from the news stories today, one man's suicide is another man's assassination. So there was always a cloud around Allende's so-called suicide or his death. But certainly it was the aftermath that was so terrible. Thousands of Chileans were just disappeared, murdered by right-wing death squads, by the military, who were openly fascist. Pinochet was an open sympathizer of General Francisco Franco, the fascist leader of Spain. A number of people have said that Henry Kissinger played an important role in this bloodbath that was perpetrated by the right-wingers in Chile. It was still the Cold War, and the CIA, or American intelligence, apparently was also working in Argentina with anti-communists. It was part of what was called Operation Condor. Operation Condor was a clandestine anti-communist operation and a cooperation between American intelligence agencies, primarily the CIA, and right-wing anti-communists in Chile, Argentina, and the Southern Cone, who rounded up leftists, students, labor demonstrators, peasants, anyone who was trying to change the system and just make them disappear. Another factor was in the Far East. As a result of the Nixon-Kissinger meeting to China, there was an opening up of business relationships between the United States and China, and China began to surge forward in the 1970s and especially in the 1980s. And so China began to just move forward very quickly and began to adopt really more private enterprise economic systems and began to really abandon a lot of the classic rigid Marxist Leninist economic systems. Similarly, a number of countries in East Asia began to bound forward and leap forward economically. Specifically South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taiwan. These countries were known as the Asian Tigers because of their rapid, robust economic growth. Meanwhile, Japan had been rapidly progressing since the end of World War II. By 1948, only 3 years after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan had really reached its pre-war level of production. So in 1948, after the horrific destruction of Japan, it had the same industrial output that it had had in 1939. And that's an amazing comeback. And of course, by the 1970s and 80s, Japan had greatly exceeded its wartime, its pre-war, its post-war levels. Mainly, of course, because Japan had no 1% of Japan's GNP went for military expenditures. All the rest, Japan had no armed forces, no army, no navy, no land army, only police force, So all of Japan's resources went into economic development, and they used their resources very widely. Japanese businessmen were very savvy. This is described also in your book. Now, this was also the period, of course, of the Arab oil boycott. Amid great fanfare, Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat signed a peace treaty at Camp David under the auspices of Jimmy Carter in 1974, but unfortunately that did not last. And the Camp David agreement that Jimmy Carter really tried to broke away. Begin reneged on a lot of his agreements shortly after the meeting, and then Sadat was assassinated, and most of the Arabs turned against the Camp David agreement, and the Israelis didn't believe in it themselves. So we really, both Begin and Sadat received the Nobel Peace Prize, but they really didn't accomplish much at all. In Iran, there was a revolution at the end of the decade, but before I get to that, we should talk also briefly about the Soviets in Afghanistan. Afghanistan went through a series of political upheavals, which are mentioned in your book, but to make a long story short, there was a struggle between the Afghan communists and the Afghan anti-communists, the Muslim fundamentalists, who were called the Mujahideen. They were the Afghan anti-communists, the religious people. Now the Mujahideen were supported clandestinely by the CIA. And along with the Afghan Mujahideen was a new organization, an Islamic militant group called Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda was founded and funded by a Saudi millionaire, a man who came from a millionaire family in Saudi Arabia, whose name was Osama bin Laden. And he had always had a CIA connection. And so you should just know that. Congress was very distrustful of the CIA during the 1970s, and Senator Frank Church was really one of the major critics of the CIA. And in 1973, Congress passed the War Powers Resolution, which was designed to limit the president's ability to make war. Finally, we're going to wrap this up by talking about, very briefly, the Iran hostage crisis. The Shah of Iran, who had been put in power by the CIA, by American intelligence back in 1953, was finally overthrown in 1979 by a coalition of students and religious imams. In Persian it was called the Imam, the Ayatollah. They were the religious leaders. Now the students, really unbeknownst to the Ayatollah, took over the American embassy and held several American diplomats. In fact, about approximately 40 diplomats were held hostage. Then the Carter administration tried to rescue the diplomats with an armed intervention called Operation Eagle Claw that totally failed. Ignominiously failed. It was a huge embarrassment for the United States, and a huge humiliation for the United States. Finally, towards the end, after the presidential, towards the end of, they were held over a year, from early 1979 until early 1981. So when Jimmy Carter ran for president in 1980, the hostages were still being held in Tehran, and it was one of the major factors in Ronald Reagan's victory. And finally, partly as a way of kind of embarrassing Carter, the Iranians let the hostages go a few months after the presidential election, early in 1981, just before Ronald Reagan was inaugurated. And so the Iranian hostage crisis, has poisoned American relations right up until the present time. And so, a lot of Americans, even today, at this time of the nuclear treaty that we've signed with Iran still have this hostage crisis in mind. This period of internal conflicts, this was a time of disillusionment over Watergate, over the Arab oil embargo, over the fall of Saigon. It was a time of change, of the gay rights movement, of the feminist movement, of the counterculture, of what we call the culture wars, not the counterculture, but the culture wars. All of this was happening within American society, and Americans were becoming increasingly disillusioned with foreign policy. But at the same time, in the world at large, there were factors leading to the end of the Cold War, and there were factors leading really to a rise in more democratic systems in Latin America, in Africa. You should look at Cuba's involvement in Angola. You should look at the whole issue of communist involvement in both in Angola and Ethiopia. So the world was changing during this period of time, but the United States really had no real consistent set of foreign policies.